I've always been close to Nathan. As siblings, we shared more than most. Inside jokes, late-night talks, a shorthand that only we understood. Growing up, we were inseparable, partners in crime, navigating the chaos of family life together. But as we got older, something began to shift. The bond that felt so natural suddenly felt heavier, more complicated. And I couldn't tell if it was just me who noticed. The evening started like any other. We were at the cabin, our parents out for the evening, leaving Nathan and me alone. The warmth of the fire crackled in the hearth, and I had changed into something more comfortable. A deep, red dress I had thrown into my bag at the last minute. It hugged my curves in a way I hadn't intended, the fabric clinging to my waist and dipping low at the neckline. I had barely thought about it when I put it on, but now as Nathan's eyes flicked toward me, I felt exposed. "You're all dressed up for a night in," he said, his tone casual, but his gaze lingered. I shrugged, brushing off the comment. "It's just a dress. I wanted to be comfortable." "Comfortable," he repeated, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Looks more like you're trying to make a statement." I rolled my eyes, sitting down across from him. "You're ridiculous." "Maybe," he said, leaning back in his chair. His eyes, though, didn't leave me. There was something in his gaze that made my stomach twist. A weight, an intensity I hadn't seen before. We decided to watch a movie, settling onto the couch with a bowl of popcorn between us. The movie was something light-hearted, but I couldn't focus. Nathan's presence beside me felt too close, the heat from his body radiating across the small space between us. When his hand brushed against mine as we both reached for the popcorn, I froze. "Sorry," he said, his voice low. "It's fine," I replied, my cheeks burning as I pulled my hand away. Halfway through the movie I stood, needing an excuse to move. "I'm going to grab some water," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. "Want me to get it for you?" Nathan offered, his eyes following me as I moved toward the kitchen. "No, I've got it," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, taking deep breaths to steady myself. I was overthinking things, I told myself. Nathan was just being Nathan. But when I caught my reflection in the window, the way the dress clung to my body, the flush on my cheeks, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Why do I feel like this? I wondered. And why does it feel like he sees it too? When I returned, Nathan had moved closer to the fire, sitting on the floor with his back against the couch. He looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable. "Come sit," he said, patting the space beside him. "I'm fine here," I said, sitting back on the couch. "Ellie," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "Sit with me." I hesitated, but something in his tone made me move. I settled on the floor beside him, the warmth of the fire making the air feel heavier. We sat in silence for a while, the crackling flames the only sound in the room. "Do you ever think about how things used to be?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. "What do you mean?" I asked, turning to look at him. "Back when we were kids," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "When everything was simple." "Yeah," I said softly. "I miss that sometimes." "Me too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But things change." The way he said it made my chest tighten, and I felt the air between us shift. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he turned to look at me. His eyes were darker than usual, filled with something I couldn't name. "You look different tonight," he said, his voice low. "It's just a dress," I said quickly, my cheeks burning. "It's not just the dress," he said, his gaze unwavering. "It's you." He felt a lump form in my throat, and I stood abruptly, unable to handle the weight of his words. "I'm going to bed," I said, my voice trembling. "Ellie," he said, his voice stopping me in my tracks. "Wait." He turned, my heart pounding as I met his gaze. The way he was looking at me made my chest ache, a mix of longing and something forbidden. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Never mind," he said finally. "Good night." "Good night," I replied, my voice shaking as I turned and walked away. When I closed the door to my room, I leaned against it, my breath coming in short bursts. I didn't know what he had wanted to say, but part of me feared I already knew. And as I caught sight of myself in the mirror, the red dress, the flush on my cheeks, I couldn't ignore the truth that was building inside me. It was wrong. I knew that, but when I thought about the way Nathan's eyes lingered on me, the way his voice softened when he said my name, I felt something I couldn't deny. Something I couldn't stop. The morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden walls. I hoped the brightness would chase away the unease that had settled in my chest, but it didn't. Last night lingered like a shadow, every glance and word replaying in my mind. I told myself to forget it, to act like everything was normal. But when I stepped into the kitchen and saw Nathan sitting there, his hair messy from sleep and his gaze catching mine, I knew it wasn't that simple. "Morning," he said, his voice soft, a small smile playing on his lip. "Morning," I replied, busying myself with pouring a cup of coffee. I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my hands tremble slightly. "You okay?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Why wouldn't I be?" I said quickly, not meeting his gaze. He didn't respond, but the silence that followed felt loaded. Finally I turned, and the way he looked at me, intense and unguarded, made my breath hitch. The day passed slowly, every interaction between us tinged with a tension that neither of us addressed. Our parents, oblivious, planned a hike after lunch, leaving Nathan and me to our own devices. "You two should take a walk, enjoy the fresh air," Mom suggested, completely unaware of the turmoil bubbling beneath the surface. "Sure," Nathan said, glancing at me. I nodded, though the thought of being alone with him made my stomach twist. The trail behind the cabin was quiet, the sounds of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only noise. Nathan walked beside me, his hands shoved into his pockets. He was unusually quiet, and the silence between us felt heavier with every passing minute. "Are you mad at me?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. I glanced at him, startled. "What? No, why would I be? I don't know," he said, shrugging. "You've been distant." "I'm not distant," I said quickly, though my tone was unconvincing. "You are," he insisted, stopping in his tracks. "Ever since last night." My heart pounded as I turned to face him. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Ellie," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Don't do that. Don't pretend you don't feel it too." "Feel what?" I asked, though I already knew. "This," he said, gesturing between us. "The way things have changed. The way you look at me, the way I—" trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to explain it, but I know you feel it too." He shook my head, taking a step back. "Nathan, we're siblings. This isn't right." "I know that," he said, his voice breaking. "But it doesn't change how I feel." His words hung in the air, and I felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was written all over my face. The walk back to the cabin was silent, the distance between us growing with every step. When we returned, I locked myself in my room, needing space to breathe. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. How had things come to this? And why couldn't I stop the part of me that wanted to hear more? Later that evening, Nathan knocked on my door. "Ellie," he said softly, "can we talk?" I hesitated before opening the door. He stood there, his expression unreadable. His expression unreadable. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Can we just sit?" he asked, nodding toward the couch in my room. I stepped aside, letting him in. We sat in silence for a moment, the tension between us palpable. Finally, he spoke. I want to lose you. You won't, I said quickly. But we can't. We can't keep doing this. I know, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. But it's hard to ignore something that feels this real. His honesty broke something inside me, and I felt tears welling in my eyes. Nathan, I don't know what to do. Me neither, he admitted. But I know I don't want to pretend this doesn't exist. He looked at him then, and the vulnerability in his eyes made my chest ache. This has to stop, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Okay, he said, nodding. If that's what you want? It is, I said, but the words felt like a lie. As he stood to leave, his hand brushed against mine, and the touch sent a shiver through me. He paused, his gaze meeting mine. Good night, Ellie, he said softly, his voice lingering in the quiet. Good night, I whispered, my heart racing as he walked out of the room. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of his words, the honesty in his gaze haunted me. I told myself it was wrong, that I couldn't let this happen, but no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the truth. Part of me didn't want it to stop. The next morning, the sunlight felt harsher, like it was illuminating all the thoughts I'd been trying to bury. Nathan and I avoided each other at breakfast, our interactions clipped and polite, like we were strangers instead of siblings. Mom noticed, her brow furrowing as she sipped her coffee. You two okay? You're unusually quiet. Rare fine, I said quickly, avoiding Nathan's gaze. Just tired, Nathan added, his tone casual, but I could hear the tension underneath. After breakfast, Mom and Dad left to run errands in town, leaving Nathan and me alone in the cabin. The silence between us was deafening. I busied myself with tidying up, wiping down already clean counters, and rearranging the same stack of magazines 3 times. I felt his presence before I saw him, standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. Ellie, he said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. What? I asked, not looking up. We can't keep pretending, he said, stepping into the room. It's not working. I turned to face him, my arms crossed over my chest. What do you want me to say, Nathan? That you're right? That I feel it too? Because I can't. Why not? He asked, his tone more insistent now. Why can't you just be honest? Because it doesn't matter. I snapped, my voice rising. It doesn't change the fact that this is wrong. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hands clenching at his sides. You think I don't know that? You think I don't hate myself for feeling this way? The rawness in his voice stopped me in my tracks. I wanted to argue, to tell him to stop, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. That afternoon, the tension between us reached its breaking point. I was sitting on the porch, trying to read, when Nathan came out and sat beside me. The proximity made my chest tighten, but I didn't move. I need to say something, he said finally, his voice low. Don't, I said quickly, my eyes fixed on the book in my hands. I have to, he insisted. I have to, he insisted, because I can't keep this bottled up anymore. I closed the book, my hands trembling. Nathan, please. You mean everything to me, Ellie, he said, his words rushing out. More than you should, and I know it's wrong. But I can't pretend it isn't true. I turned to him, my breath catching at the intensity in his gaze. Nathan, we're siblings, I said, my voice trembling. This can't happen. I know, he said, his voice breaking, but I can't stop how I feel. The vulnerability in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong. But the truth was staring back at me. Undeniable. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither do I, he said, his hand brushing against mine. The touch sent a jolt through me, and I pulled away quickly, my heart racing. "We can't," I said firmly, standing and moving away from him. "This has to stop." Nathan didn't argue, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't giving up. "I just want you to know how I feel," he said softly. "That's all." That evening, our parents decided to visit friends nearby, leaving Nathan and me alone again. The cabin felt too quiet, the air heavy with unspoken tension. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to be busy, while Nathan sat in the living room, the TV playing softly in the background. "Ellie," he called, his voice drawing me out of my thoughts. "What?" I replied, stepping into the doorway. "Come sit with me," he said, gesturing to the couch. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. "I'm fine here. Please," he said, his tone gentle but firm. Against my better judgment, I walked over and sat on the far end of the couch. Nathan didn't say anything at first, his eyes fixed on the TV. Then he turned to me, his gaze intense. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said quickly, "but we have to draw a line." "And what if we already crossed it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, his words hanging in the air. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was undeniable. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally Nathan stood, running a hand through his hair. "I'm going for a walk," he said, his voice tight. "Okay," I said, my chest aching as I watched him leave. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. The way he had looked at me, the pain in his voice, it was too much. I told myself it had to end, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. Something between us had shifted, and there was no going back. The tension in the cabin had become unbearable. Every glance, every word exchanged between Nathan and me felt like a spark waiting to ignite. I tried to stay busy, occupying myself with chores, long walks, and anything that would keep me out of his orbit. But no matter what I did, he was always there. His presence unavoidable, his gaze lingering, his words weighted with things he wasn't saying. That morning, our parents announced they'd be leaving early to visit some local friends, giving Nathan and me the house to ourselves for most of the day. "You two behave," Mom joked, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. I forced a smile, nodding as they drove away, leaving us standing in the quiet driveway. The silence stretched between us as we returned inside. I made a beeline for the kitchen, hoping to lose myself in a task, but Nathan followed, leaning against the counter as I filled the kettle. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice breaking the quiet. "No, I haven't," I said quickly, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "You have," he insisted, stepping closer. "And I get it. I know this isn't easy for you. It's not easy for me either." He slammed the kettle down, the sound echoing in the small space. "Nathan, stop. Just stop." "Why?" he asked, his tone soft but firm. "Because you don't want to talk about it. Because you're scared of what this means." "Yes," I snapped, turning to face him. "Because it scares me. Because it's wrong. And because I don't know how to make it stop." His expression softened, and he took another step toward me. "Ellie, I know it's wrong, but it's real. And pretending it isn't won't make it go away." His words hung in the air, and I felt my resolve weakening. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just be honest," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me how you feel." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned away, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to steady my breathing. "I can't," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he pressed, his voice closer now. "Because if I admit it," I said, turning to face him, "I don't know how to take it back." The air between us felt charged, electric, as we stood there, inches apart. Nathan reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt a jolt of something I couldn't name. "Ellie," he said softly, his voice carrying a vulnerability that made my chest ache. "Don't," I whispered. But I didn't pull away. I can't help it, he said, his hand moving to cup my cheek. I've tried, but I can't. Before I could respond, the kettle whistled, breaking the moment. I stepped back quickly, my heart racing as I turned off the stove. This has to stop, I said, my voice shaking. We can't keep doing this. I know, he said, his tone resigned, but it doesn't change how I feel. I didn't answer, my mind too clouded with conflicting emotions. Instead, I busied myself with making tea, avoiding his gaze as he lingered in the doorway. The rest of the day passed in a haze of avoidance. I stayed outside for hours, wandering through the woods and trying to clear my head. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't escape the weight of what was happening between us. By the time I returned, the sun was beginning to set, casting the cabin in a warm golden light. Nathan was sitting on the porch, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared out at the horizon. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," I replied, sitting down beside him. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like we were both waiting for something to happen. After a while he spoke. "Do you remember when we were kids, and we used to sit out here and make up stories about the stars?" I smiled faintly, nodding. "You always came up with the best ones." "You always pretended mine were better," he said, a small laugh escaping his lips. "Even when they weren't, they were always better," I said, turning to look at him. His eyes met mine, and the moment felt heavier than it should have. "Ellie," he began, his voice hesitant. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said quickly, though my voice wavered. "I mean it," he said, his gaze searching mine. "No matter what happens, I need you to know that." He nodded, my chest tightening as I tried to hold back the tears threatening to spill. "I know." For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped, like nothing else existed but the two of us. And then, without thinking, I leaned in, my forehead resting against his. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental. "We shouldn't," I whispered, though I didn't move. "I know," he said, his voice trembling, "but I can't stop." His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt my resolve crumbling. The line between us was blurring, and I didn't know how to stop it. As the first stars appeared in the sky, I realized with a sinking feeling that I didn't want to. The air in the cabin felt stifling that night, every corner of the space charged with an unspoken tension. I stayed in my room, pacing back and forth as the weight of what was happening between Nathan and me bore down on me. My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of guilt, desire, and fear. I knew I should stay away, draw a line that could never be crossed again, but every time I thought of his voice, his touch, my resolve faltered. A soft knock at my door broke my spiral of thoughts. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ellie," Nathan's voice was low, careful, as if he knew I might not answer. I hesitated, staring at the door, as if it held the answers I was so desperately searching for. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Can I come in?" he asked. His tone was gentle but insistent, and I knew he wouldn't leave without an answer. I opened the door, my breath catching at the sight of him. His hair was slightly tousled, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "Nathan, we shouldn't," I began, but the words died in my throat as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Ellie," he said softly, his gaze locking with mine. "I can't stop thinking about you, about us." "There is no us," I said quickly, though my voice betrayed the lie. "There is," he said, his hand brushing against mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and I didn't pull away. "You feel it too. Don't pretend you don't." He turned away, wrapping my arms around myself, as if it could shield me from the truth. "It doesn't matter how I feel," I whispered. "It's wrong." "Then why can't we stay away from each other?" he asked, stepping closer. Why does it feel like this every time we're in the same room? I didn't have an answer, and he didn't wait for one. He reached out, his hand gently turning me to face him. His fingers brushed against my cheek, his touch hesitant but deliberate. Ellie, he whispered, his voice trembling. I can't stop. Before I could respond, his lips met mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away. But when I didn't, when I leaned into him instead, it deepened, all the tension we'd been holding back, spilling over in a wave of emotion. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melt into him. My heart raced as his touch became more confident, his hands brushing against the curve of my back. Every movement felt like crossing another line. But I couldn't bring myself to care. The fire crackled softly in the background, the glow casting flickering shadows across the room. We sank to the floor, the warmth of the flames mirroring the heat between us. His hands explored with a mix of hesitation and longing, his touch both gentle and firm. When his fingers brushed against the fabric of my dress, sliding it slightly from my shoulder, I felt my breath hitch. Nathan, I whispered, my voice trembling. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. If you want me to stop, I will, but I couldn't. Instead, I reached for him, my hands threading through his hair as I pulled him closer. Every touch, every whispered word felt like falling deeper into something we couldn't escape. Hours later, we lay tangled together on the floor, the fire reduced to embers. His hand brushed against mine, and I turned to meet his gaze. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that made my chest ache. I don't regret this, he said softly, his voice steady. Do you? I hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I don't know, I admitted, but I'm scared. Well, figure it out, he said, his hand intertwining with mine. Together. The sound of the car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment, and we both froze. I scrambled to my feet, smoothing my dress as panic set in. Nathan, we can't. I know, he said quickly, his voice tense. Just act normal. Our parents' laughter echoed through the cabin as they entered, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. I avoided their gazes, my chest tight, as I forced a smile and answered their questions about how we'd spent the evening. Later that night, I found Nathan on the porch, staring out at the stars. I hesitated before joining him, my heart heavy with everything we couldn't say. Hey, I said softly, sitting beside him. Hey, he replied, his voice quiet. For a moment, we sat in silence, the tension between us almost unbearable. Finally, he spoke. I meant what I said earlier. I don't regret it. Nathan, I began. But he cut me off. You don't have to say anything, he said, his gaze still fixed on the stars. I just needed you to know. He looked at him, my chest aching with a mix of guilt and longing. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He admitted, turning to meet my gaze. But whatever happens, I don't want to lose you. You won't, I said, though my voice wavered. We'll figure it out. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, I realized that nothing between us would ever be the same. The line we'd crossed had changed everything, and there was no going back. But in that moment, sitting beside Nathan, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Not yet. Thank you, dear listener, for staying with us until the very end of this emotional and complicated journey. What do you think about the choices made by our main character? Were they driven by genuine connection, or did emotions cloud their judgment? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this situation. Share your perspective in the comments below. Was this story about love, betrayal, or simply a forbidden bond that spiraled out of control? Let us know how you'd handle such a situation. And don't forget to hit the like button if this story kept you hooked and subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales that challenge emotions, boundaries, and the human experience. Stay tuned. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. Until next time.